Welcome back to another episode of Tech Unhinged, where tech gets human. I'm your host, Rabia Javeed, and today we are joined by someone who knows exactly how tech companies scale and how they fail. Joffrey is a director at Bullhound, a global technology advisory firm that has completed over $50 billion in transactions backing category leaders like Unity, Spotify, Slack, and Klarna. He spent the past decade advising European B2B software companies, leading dozens of M&A capital deals with some of the world's top private equity investors. Today, Joffrey specializes in the office of the CFO space and focuses on advising European tech businesses, offering software for finance teams. Joffrey studied engineering and machine learning before specializing in finance, giving him rare visibility into both the numbers and the technology driving modern innovation. Joffrey, welcome to Tech Unhinged.
Thanks, Rabia. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, let's dive into the icebreakers for our audience and listeners. Joffrey, you've studied engineering, finance, and machine learning. Which one actually makes you the most dangerous in the boardroom?
Yeah, finance for sure. I mean, engineering and machine learning are definitely useful skills to understand the product. But my job as an investment banker is really to challenge how the roadmap shows in the numbers. And that's where board members are really expecting me to translate, narrative and numbers into risk and valuation and opportunities for shareholders. So really the finance skill set is the main one.
Well, you're definitely the one people have to be sort of beware of in the boardroom.
Absolutely.
So, Joffrey, if spreadsheets disappeared tomorrow, would the industry collapse or would CFOs finally have a better sleep?
Oh my God. First of all, I would probably not have a better sleep if spreadsheets collapse tomorrow. But I would say, and this is probably a general feeling that, still Excel is the glue that ties a lot of systems together. And so even 4 years after Excel has been introduced to the market, I still think we have that as a foundational tool. So yeah, for sure that would be a bad day for finance people everywhere.
Yeah, I can imagine what sort of a havoc it's going to break because even till date, not just finance people, but many people out there are reliant on spreadsheets.
Yeah.
So, Joffrey, if we do a bit of a context setting for our topic in hand today, from growth at all costs to efficiency first, what fundamentally changed in tech markets that made capital efficiency the new strategic priority?
Yeah. Beautiful way to get into it. I would say two big things have changed for sure in the past decade. The first one is, we were in an environment where money was abundant and capital was relatively accessible, which means that, if you could show enough top line growth, then the market would forgive your inefficiencies. But then interest rates went up and, the exit markets cooled down and limited partners who are ultimately the investors into private equity funds started to ask harder questions. And, the growth at all cost dynamic kind of stopped. And after a while, and, what we see today is that growth is no longer looked in isolation, but in conjunction with other pieces. So obviously, if capital efficiency being an important one. So that's probably one big leg of it. And then the second one is for sure the level of scrutiny and the level of sophistication that investors have brought to the table. The best private equity investors have data on thousands of B2B SaaS companies. They know what good looks like, not only, let's say, in the global remit of B2B SaaS, but also in your specific subsegment for your customer size, for your industry, if you're vertical. And so that means that you're no longer compared as a company to your last quarter, but you're compared to a cohort of your peers, which are actually sitting in your peer group. So, that makes inefficient growth very, very visible and very quickly. And so this is what, has changed fundamentally and what has made capital efficiency such an important point. It's not about becoming conservative, just to be clear. It's about showing that you have earned the right to keep investing. And that shows up in every part of the business and things as trivial as travel and expense. You see it show up because it's a true test to the company's ability to be efficient in managing long tail spend. If people hate the process, they don't record their expenses, or at least they find a route around it, and then you're no longer in control of the data. And, if they love the expense process, then they just engage with it. It gives you real-time visibility on the business and you know how you deploy cash. So this is the kind of operational discipline that investors are expecting now.
So if we dive a bit deeper into that and have a historical perspective on this, we've seen multiple market cycles from the investment banking side. What mistakes did companies make in the hyper growth era that are no longer survivable today?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't call them mistakes as much as it was a mindset that no longer applies to everything. And just to be clear as well, there are pockets of the market where this hyper growth mindset still works, and AI driven or AI first companies probably are part of that. But let's say if you zoom out and think about hyper growth era, in that moment, your job was to grab as much market share as you can as quickly as you could. And the idea was, or the assumption was, the next funding round would always be there. And so when you're in that world as a founder or as an operator, it's almost like every problem can be solved, right? Like just hire more people or spend more capital and you'll just solve the problem. That made sense at the time, but now in a very down-to-earth way, those same principles and the way it's cascaded into the organization, it no longer works, right? And one way that you see it happening at a very, basic level is, for instance, if you're a manager, your team size is no longer a proxy for your importance in the firm. And this is a very difficult mindset shift because now it's almost like the bigger your team, the bigger the scrutiny on what it delivers. And so, if you can't pivot from the mindset of building empires and into let's make sure we know the impact of every euro spend, you're definitely going to have a hard time in this more of a capital tightening era.
You worked with finance leaders across Europe and then the US as well. Where do you see Europe leading in capital efficiency and governance, and where is it still catching up compared to the US?
It's always a contrast that's useful to do. Europe versus US, because it's true that those two geographies have very different dynamics. Let me start with Europe. I would say in Europe, the bar for governance is quite high. So, boards are very formal. You have strong regulatory frameworks. So as a result, you have like audit and controls, which are very present in the business. And then the next point is also companies are used to operating with less capital compared to their US peers, because obviously there's less capital, less talent available. And so you have to be you're inherently more constrained than if you were in the US. And so I think a lot of the businesses that we advise in Europe have learned to grow with this kind of mindset that they won't access the same level of the capital as potentially their US competitors. And so what the benefit of that is, they think a lot more about the concept of durable growth, how we can make that sustainable over time, rather than like how we can make just the next round happen. Now that I've said that, I would say that US companies have this feature of, they've learned early to use finance as a pivotal tool for decision making. And I've seen CFOs of US companies use very sophisticated KPI frameworks and very comfortable making fast calls and going after bets on the basis of data that's available, even if it's incomplete. And then when you do that, you have a better operating cadence, right? And you're able to place bets a lot more in a given year. Then a lot of the US companies also have the discipline to say, this is the moment where we cut, this doesn't work, this is the moment where we cut. So this kind of operating cadence is something that European companies are catching up to now. And, for sure for finance and tech leaders in general, it's a constant learning to kind of be in that mindset, having the constraints and the regulatory framework on one end, but also learning to operate with a certain level of comfort to be at pace in a way.
Yeah. So if you happen to have a chance, would you move back to the US market, or you would want to stick with where you are?
Definitely would stick in Europe. I'm sure the US market is exciting, but Europe is probably where advisors like us are really needed to help, push the envelope and help transform some of the ambition that we have here. So sticking to Europe for sure.
We see that historically finance followed innovation. How has this relationship flipped at the moment, where finance now is setting the tempo for innovation?
Yeah. I really like the way you frame that question around, setting the tempo, because I do think that, a relationship hasn't flipped as much as it seems like it has. For one reason, which is that, in tech, product always leads. You're not a company with spreadsheets, for sure. But as you rightly put it, the product side now moves a lot more in partnership or in tandem with the finance side. And while the goals are still very ambitious, now the idea is that the CFOs are becoming core architects of how we get to those goals. Right. And it used to be like finance guys used to show after the fact and say, here's what happened in the past quarter. And now they have to frame the trade-offs of how we make decisions to get to or to deliver that roadmap, because roadmap needs capital, but it also needs clear ROI. In the best companies I've worked with, I know that CFOs scrutinize very rigorously the impact of an AI investment into, for instance, payback. If that's what you're after. Navan has done a beautiful job when it listed at explaining to investors how it was focusing AI to help increase gross margin by diminishing the need for support in certain areas of the business. And so if you can have finance that provides that real-time picture of what is the ROI of our investments, then you have this real tandem between, okay, here's where we're putting the effort on the tech side, and here's how it shows up on the finance side. And for that, you need to shorten the feedback loop as much as we can. I think this is definitely a topic where there's a lot to do in finance.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to dive into the AI side of the things as well. But before that, for all the leaders listening you today, how can you tell when a company's financial tools, systems, and processes are actually limiting growth instead of supporting it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've seen dozens of companies in my career, and I wouldn't say there is a single rule, but there are definitely some telltale signs that something in the back end should be functioning differently. So I'm gonna give you a couple. Maybe one is if you have different version of the truth in different teams. So if you ask for an AR number and the go-to-market and the product teams don't have, or let's say the go-to-market and the management team don't have the same number, that means that something isn't working in the back end. And more importantly, it means that potentially some decision making is slower or more predictable than it needs to be. Go-to-market has a different incentive on what AR could be versus what the management reports or wants to report. So that's one. Another one that's relatively obvious is the level of attrition in the finance team. I mean, if you have people who have to build spreadsheet forests to reconcile your numbers at the end of the month, that's probably isn't sustainable, and you're going to see that in how people are just remaining or not with your team. And the last one, and probably one of the most fundamental one that we see very early is how. And this ties back to my previous point around shortening the feedback loop. It's like, how long does it take you to close the books? If you're a mid-market company and it takes you like more than 15 business days to get a clarity on what the last month was, then probably something isn't working well in the back end, and you're flying a plane with a fogged cockpit, essentially. And so you have modern tools like CPM, which is corporate performance management, whose job is essentially to consolidate inputs from different sides of the business and making sure you have one central nervous system that everybody's looking at, regardless of whether you're in finance or not. These tools are no longer an option in mid-market companies because you have to know how you're navigating. Otherwise, for sure, your tools and your systems are not delivering what it should do for on the finance side of things.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And, this has some good takeaways for our listeners as well. And no wonder a lot of companies are still, way back into those old trenches, and they are not even keeping up with the AI.
Yeah.
So they're probably in their own bubbles, only that it's going to burst pretty soon because even the companies who are at the same scale with AI today, they can barely catch up because it's like every day there's something new in it that's
Absolutely.
there.
You bring up a good point. In all fairness, all of those businesses that we see are so busy kind of building and growing that, when we prepare a transaction for them or with them, we arrive at a point that is in some way early in their life, regardless of how big they are, whether they're 50 million of AR or 200 million of AR, they're still early in their life. And so not everything can be perfect or has to be perfect. However, as you bring it up, for sure, innovation doesn't happen if you don't have that financial discipline. So you have to find a way so that the trade-off works in a way so that, you don't completely have a finance function that doesn't work or is completely deprived of resources, but at the same time that you're not lagging from trying to catch up on the innovation side. It's a very valid point.
But also, now, Joffrey, when we dive into the cost-heavy AI world, we see that AI is expensive, be it infrastructure, data, or talent. And we also see that, Europe was probably one of the first regions to have an AI Act and companies to sort of act on, right? So how
Yeah.
successful are the tech companies deciding where to invest and what to say no to in the times of AI?
Yeah, it's a theme that's started to come up a lot, and we see companies, whether that's our clients or companies we talk to in the market regularly, putting together frameworks for how they invest in AI, and try to stick to those frameworks. Definitely lots of moving parts. I would say that the magic is probably not in the scoring model. Or in the framework itself. I would say the magic ties into the ability, or at least the discipline, to revisit those frameworks or those scores as real data comes in, right? This is where again finance is very strategic. Companies are trying to build now, a lot of businesses that we advise, they're trying to build now what I discussed earlier, which is self-updating life forecasts, a real-time view of the business. It's very hard to do. Not a lot of companies are doing it. We're probably like 2 to 5 years away to do that. But in order to do that, you have to pull signals from across the organization and get integrated view of everything that updates very frequently. If you want to get there, it's not all about AI. It's also a lot about infrastructure, organizational design, and things like that. And so I think successful companies now are the ones that are taking stock of what they need to do first in order to then, fully put a bet on AI when it comes to their internal operations, and then let alone what happens on the customer facing side, because that's again a roadmap decision. But at least on the internal side, the best companies are taking the time to figure out what they need to do first in order to leverage that AI revolution tomorrow. That's at least the case in Europe. Probably US is 1 to 3 years ahead of that, to your earlier point around the contrast between the two regions.
Joffrey, when today you evaluate B2B software companies, right? What metrics matter more than the revenue growth?
Yeah, I love that question as a financier for sure. Metric is metric, right? I could talk about that all day. But you're right, growth is still the driver of value, the biggest one, at least in B2B SaaS. And as we hinted to earlier, the next question becomes, how efficient is that growth, or how expensive it is? And you have multiple metrics that you can look at. But instead of kind of spreading out those metrics, I think there are two that come to mind that I think are very relevant for two reasons. One, they're easy to put together. They don't require a lot of spreadsheets. And two, they're hard to manipulate. So the first one is ARR per FTE. So how big is your company compared to the people that you have? This is very telling because it's a very easily available benchmark. We know that companies, for instance, between 20 and 50 million of ARR typically run at 150 to 250K per employee of ARR. And so someone like a company operating efficiently would be probably above that 250K threshold. It's something that's very easy to evaluate. The other one, which probably the most finance type listeners of your audience have probably heard of is the rule of 40, which is if you add together the growth from the last 12 months and the EBITDA margin from the last 12 months. So you add up two percentages that aren't really comparable, but that somehow make up a benchmark for how the trade-off between growth and efficiency should happen. And I think those two metrics put together, very available in the market. And so they're easy to evaluate where a company is trading, whether top quartile or kind of average in those segments. The metrics that if you perform well in, it doesn't guarantee you a premium outcome when you do your next transaction. But if you have a bad performance in it, it almost always caps it.
And it always catches up with the revenue growth as well, if you've got these right.
Yes, absolutely. Growth will be the premium driver for sure. But then those two, if you look at them individually or conjunctly with revenue growth, will then be the next indicator of, okay, how good is that company at growing? And you have extreme examples of that. Like we have companies in the rule of 40 that are growing 100% but burning 60% of their revenues, and this is the growth at all cost model. And you have companies maybe growing 20% but doing 20% EBITDA margin and delivering that year after year. Those are two different models and two different ways to evaluate them, but they tell you a lot about how growth is being prioritized over efficiency in the business.
Absolutely. So Joffrey, if we speak about workforce realignment driven by AI automation in particular, we see that it's reshaping how technology companies manage labor costs alongside financial discipline. So how is AI-driven workforce realignment influencing cost efficiency strategies within tech companies at the moment?
Yeah, very interesting. let me tell you what I see from my perspective, which is that in Europe, we're probably at the beginning of that curve. And the leaders, CEOs and founders that I speak to are more in a no hire, no fire mode right now. They're trying to understand first by experimenting in pockets where changes really lies and where they need to essentially put more pressure or put more effort. And in the finance function more specifically, you see pilots around how consolidation and reporting and forecasting, but it's still at a very small scale. And we think that over time the mindset will be, let's see what this does to quality, and then let's restructure teams to make sure that we empower them to no longer do the tasks that should be automated and actually let them operate the business. So my conviction is that we won't see like waves of firing, but rather waves of reorganizations of like how the teams operate inside the business and how they communicate with the other parts of the business as well.
All right, Joffrey. So now if we move towards the innovation and how financial discipline is meeting it, let's talk about how some leaders worry discipline kills creativity, and there's a lot of debate around that. In your view, how do high-performing companies balance risk-taking with financial rigor?
To your point around discipline kills creativity, in my experience, the opposite is true. The most disciplined founders I've worked with are also the ones who took the boldest bets. And the difference is that they knew exactly what the perimeter of the bet was, and the stage they wanted to go and set for it. How that translated in what I've seen is some of the best companies are really good at separating the sandbox from the core. So what is your experiments that you're really trying to figure out whether they can create long-term value versus what is it that you cannot compromise on, where you have to scrutinize your business in every sense of the way. And that discipline on the core is what earns them the right to run experiments elsewhere in the business. So I think that's really how they get to that balance between financial discipline but also risk taking.
And based on all the tech companies you worked with during M&A and investment deals, what cultural patterns, be it behaviors, mindsets, or leadership styles, you see differentiate resilient operators from those who stall when capital tightens?
Yeah, I don't have like a single answer for that. I would say that as long as culture works and is deeply rooted, as long as it's deeply rooted but also works for performance, then I think you have a system that can manage regardless of the values themselves. But one combination that I've learned to observe and like over the years is a combination of having brutal honesty, not just between ourselves but also everyone with themselves, and at the same time empowering talent. So let me kind of break that down. If I think about companies that are brutally honest, they don't hide behind vanity metrics. They publish the numbers, and they'll look at eroding cohort profitability. They'll take stock of growing segment level churn, and they won't treat that as bad information or bad news. They'll treat that as actual information, and they won't move into blame. They'll move into solution. That's point number one. And to move into solution, I find that if you have a culture that really empowers people at the local level to make decisions, raise the hand, really operate within your business, then that creates a good soil to then move into the solution, into the solution process. And I find that combination, when I've seen it, to be very powerful.
So another quote that goes by, Joffrey: finance leaders are becoming the new product leaders. Would you agree, strongly agree, or is that oversimplifying this entire shift?
I would say no. It's a nice phrase to coin. I wouldn't be the one coining it. I would say in the sense that I think where the statement is right is that what's changing is that CFOs are becoming the co-designer of the strategy. They're not the product, like they're not the driver, but they're no longer just the reporter of outcomes either. And because they have this bird's eye view on the business, they can definitely shape the agenda in a very powerful way. But for sure, they're not the ones defining that agenda themselves. So my position would be probably disagree overall, but agree to the spirit of where the question is headed.
Well, you were agreeing to disagree.
I think where the question makes sense is finance now has a say in roadmap where it didn't have one in 5 years ago, I would say, at least in most companies. So
Yeah, because you see, from an outsider's perspective, it took me sort of a while to understand that how important finance departments are. They might be the people with the most introvertish personality, but they are the big guns.
I heard this beautiful quote a while ago, which was, 30 years ago, finance had the power, and now it feels like data has the power. But yeah, what happened in the meantime is that data ended up as, flowing a lot through finance. So it ended up having this circle back to the finance team, who ultimately, unbeknownst to them, became again somehow the central nervous system of the organization.
Moving towards the last theme of our podcast, which is, what is it that we look forward to and what is winning in the next decade ahead of us. So AI is automating decisions humans used to make slowly, or rather at their own pace. But what does this mean for the speed and structure of financial leadership?
Basically, to me, the change is like finance team is no longer going to be expected to produce answers and more to design systems, at least for the next 5 years. And, if you think about it, yes, for sure, until now and probably for a couple more years, finance teams spend a lot of time assembling data, trying to make sense of it, reconciling it. And hopefully with AI and better tooling, you can automate a lot of those workflows to accelerate your decision-making process. And the bottleneck will move from, can we get the numbers, which is still the, bottleneck for many companies today, and rightly so, to, do we trust the numbers and can we act fast enough based on that? And to me, that's the frontier that a lot of companies will have to cross in the next 2-3 years.
If you had to pick, Joffrey, what will separate the survivors from the winners in tech space over the next 5 years?
The winners will be the ones who are able to re-architect themselves around this new AI paradigm, just like it happened when software kind of exploded and started eating the world. And what that means, and this will also kind of lean into this theme of organizational design I mentioned earlier, is how can you have the proper team structure? What is your data strategy? What are the operating rules? What are the workflows that you need at a very fundamental level to operate with very clean data and foundations in order to take advantage of this very big wave that's coming? That means for many companies that they'll need to learn to capture more signals, to capture them faster, to organize around, I would say, being able to create this instant feedback loop so that they can allocate capital at the greatest velocity possible. Because ultimately, this is what's going to be a surviving game against your competitors. For every point of margin your competitor can win, against you because they're more efficient, is a point on pricing or a point on go-to-market velocity or a point on something else that they will be able to take, and so slowly create an advantage for you.
So, Joffrey, moving towards our last question of the podcast, if you had to leave our listeners with one piece of advice or a hard-learned lesson, what would it be and why?
That's a tough question, but I guess a great way to finish. Look, I'd say this. If you're a CEO or a CFO right now, you probably have a 6 to 12 month breathing space right now that you can use, and you shouldn't waste it. And perhaps the best use of it is to not push another round of AI projects or cosmetic cost cutting, and to quietly rebuild the engine from the inside that you need to leverage the data tools and the AI tools of tomorrow. So you want to make sure you project what your future state for data architecture is going to be, what your key metrics that are going to be the different line drivers of your P&L are, what you want your decision-making cadence to be, and then get the financial and operational plumbing to a point where you can actually see what's going on close to real time in your business. And I would say in 2 to 3 years, this will not be something that's nice to have. It will be more and more something that you must have. And so I would say that the lesson from the past few cycles is don't try to force your organization into a level of discipline or innovation that it's not built for or architected for yet. Build the foundations first, and then you're going to be you're going to have an edge against your peers when the AI boom unfolds.
Well, what a beautiful way to end this conversation on such an important note, Joffrey. Thank you so much for such a grounded and insightful conversation.
Thank you, Rabia. It was a pleasure to discuss.
Thanks a lot, and to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on Tech Unhinged, and we'll see you next time.